In December of 1872, a merchant ship named the Mary Celeste was discovered drifting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. The sea was calm, the wind steady, and the vessel appeared to be in good condition. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. But as another ship approached and prepared to investigate, something felt wrong. There were no visible crew members on deck, no signs of movement, and no response to signals. A ship at sea without activity was never a good sign. When the boarding team finally stepped onto the deck, they expected to find answers. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. The ship was not damaged, it was not sinking, it was simply empty. The deck of the Mary Celeste showed no signs of chaos or damage. The sails were still partially set and the ropes were in place, suggesting that the ship had not been caught in a violent storm. Everything looked as if it had been left behind in the middle of normal operations. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken equipment, and no visible damage that could explain why the crew would abandon the vessel. The silence on board was deeply unsettling. In the vast emptiness of the ocean, a ship without its crew felt unnatural. It was not just the absence of people that disturbed the investigators, but the complete lack of any explanation for their disappearance. Inside the ship, the mystery deepened. In one of the cabins, a meal had been prepared but left untouched. Plates were still on the table, and personal belongings were exactly where they should have been. It appeared as though the crew had been in the middle of their daily routine when something suddenly interrupted them. There were no signs of panic inside the living quarters. No overturned furniture, no signs of violence, and no indication that anyone had tried to defend themselves. Everything suggested that whatever happened occurred quickly, leaving no time for the crew to react in an organized way. In the captain's cabin, navigation, instruments and maps were found in place. The ship's logbook provided the last recorded entries, showing that the voyage had been proceeding normally before the disappearance. The captain, his family, and the entire crew were gone without a trace. The absence of distress signals or emergency measures raised serious questions. Experienced sailors would never abandon a stable ship without a clear and immediate threat. Yet there was no visible danger on board. The ship was seaworthy, the cargo intact, and the conditions manageable. The decision to leave must have been driven by something powerful enough to override all logic. One of the most important clues was the missing lifeboat. It appeared that the crew had used it to leave the ship, but no trace of the boat or its passengers was ever found. This suggested that the crew had abandoned the Mary Celeste intentionally. However, abandoning a perfectly functional ship in the middle of the ocean would have been an extremely risky decision. Lifeboats were small, exposed, and offered little protection against the elements. The choice to leave must have been made under extreme circumstances. But without evidence of what caused that decision, the reason remained a complete mystery. When investigators examined the cargo hold, they discovered that everything was still in place. The ship had been carrying barrels of industrial alcohol, and none of them appeared to be stolen or significantly damaged. This detail eliminated the possibility of piracy, as pirates would have taken valuable cargo or left signs of violence. The barrels were tightly secured, and the structure of the ship remained intact. There were no signs of an explosion or fire. However, some of the barrels were later reported to be slightly leaking, raising the possibility that fumes may have built up inside the ship. Even so, there was no physical evidence of panic or a sudden evacuation. The cargo hold remained quiet and untouched, adding yet another layer to the mystery. At the navigation table, small irregularities were noticed. Some instruments were slightly out of place and the compass appeared to have shifted. While these details were subtle, they suggested that something unusual may have occurred shortly before the crew disappeared. The final log entry indicated that the ship was sailing normally, with no mention of danger or distress. This made the situation even more confusing. If the crew had encountered a problem serious enough to abandon the ship, why was there no record of it? The lack of communication and incomplete documentation left investigators with more questions than answers. Some investigators proposed that a sudden storm may have frightened the crew into abandoning the ship. At sea, conditions can change rapidly, and even experienced sailors can be caught off guard. However, when the Mary Celeste was found, the weather was relatively calm, and the ship showed no signs of having been damaged by a violent storm.
The sails were still functional, and the deck was not heavily damaged. This raised doubts about the storm theory. While it was possible that rough weather had occurred earlier, it did not fully explain why the crew would leave behind a stable and navigable vessel. Another possibility considered was that dense fog may have reduced visibility, creating confusion and fear among the crew. In thick fog, it can be difficult to determine direction or distance, especially in open water. The crew may have believed they were in immediate danger, possibly near land or obstacles they could not see. This might have led them to temporarily leave the ship in the lifeboat. However, even in such conditions, abandoning a large vessel for a small lifeboat would have been an extreme and dangerous choice. The theory explained some aspects of the situation, but it still failed to account for the complete disappearance of every person on board. The missing lifeboat remained one of the most critical pieces of the puzzle. If the crew had used it to escape, it suggested that they believed staying on the ship was more dangerous than leaving it. Yet no trace of the lifeboat was ever found. It was as if it had vanished along with the crew. The ocean is vast, and small boats can easily be lost, but the complete absence of any debris or remains made the situation even more mysterious. Without a lifeboat, there was no way to determine where the crew had gone or what had happened after they left the Mary Celeste. The vastness of the ocean added to the mystery. Once the crew left the ship, they would have been surrounded by nothing but water in every direction. Survival in such conditions would have been extremely difficult, especially in a small lifeboat. Without supplies, shelter, or navigation tools, the chances of survival would have been minimal. Yet no bodies were ever recovered, and no signs of wreckage were found. It was as if the crew had simply disappeared into the ocean without leaving any trace behind. As the investigation continued, theories began to multiply. Some suggested mutiny, others proposed piracy, and a few even considered the possibility of supernatural involvement. However, none of these theories were supported by solid evidence. The lack of physical clues made it impossible to confirm any single explanation. Each theory answered some questions while raising new ones. The Mary Celeste became a symbol of mystery, representing a case where logic and evidence failed to provide clear answers. Walking through the narrow corridors of the Mary Celeste, investigators reported an overwhelming sense of unease. The wooden structure creaked softly with the movement of the sea, but there were no human sounds, no footsteps, no voices, nothing. The lantern light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every door they opened revealed the same unsettling pattern. Personal belongings untouched, spaces left in mid-use, and no sign of struggle. It felt as if the crew had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. The deeper they explored, the clearer it became that this was not a normal abandonment. Something had interrupted life on board in a way that defied explanation. Walking through the narrow corridors of the Mary Celeste, investigators reported an overwhelming sense of unease. The wooden structure creaked softly with the movement of the sea, but there were no human sounds, no footsteps, no voices, nothing. The lantern light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every door they opened revealed the same unsettling pattern. Personal belongings untouched, spaces left in mid-use, and no sign of struggle. It felt as if the crew had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. The deeper they explored, the clearer it became that this was not a normal abandonment. Something had interrupted life on board in a way that defied explanation. Mary Celeste continued to drift across the ocean, carried by currents and wind, completely empty yet still intact. It was a ghost ship in every sense of the word. There was no damage that would explain an emergency, no sign of flooding, and no indication that the vessel was in danger of sinking. For experienced sailors, abandoning such a ship would have been an unthinkable decision. The more investigators studied the vessel, the more they realized that the disappearance could not be explained by ordinary maritime events. The ship itself stood as silent evidence that something unusual had occurred. Some theories suggested that the crew may have feared an impending disaster. The sight of unusual weather patterns or sudden changes in atmospheric conditions might have led them to believe the ship was in immediate danger. In such a situation, even experienced sailors can make desperate decisions. However, the evidence did not support the idea of an approaching catastrophe. There were no signs of severe weather damage, and the ship's condition remained stable. While fear may have played a role, it did not fully explain the complete and permanent disappearance of every person on board. The presence of thick fog has also been considered as a possible factor. In heavy fog, visibility can drop to almost zero, creating confusion and disorientation. The crew may have believed they were close to danger or land, prompting them to leave the ship temporarily. But even in such conditions, abandoning a vessel without a clear plan would have been extremely risky. The fog theory explains the possibility of confusion, but it does not explain why the crew never returned. If the ship had been left temporarily, it should have been easy to find again once conditions improved. If the crew had entered the lifeboat, they would have faced the overwhelming vastness of the ocean. A small vessel against powerful waves offers little protection and limited control. Without proper navigation, chances of survival would have been extremely low. The complete absence of any trace of the lifeboat suggests that it was lost quickly, possibly overwhelmed by the sea. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete. Normally, some form of debris or evidence would remain, but in this case, nothing was ever found, leaving the fate of the crew entirely unknown. Over time, the case of the Mary Celeste attracted widespread attention. Newspapers reported on the mystery, and investigators revisited the evidence repeatedly. Each new theory attempted to explain the disappearance, but none could account for every detail. The lack of physical evidence made it impossible to reach a definitive conclusion. The case became one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history, studied and debated for generations. Despite advances in technology and investigation methods, the truth remained just as elusive as it had been when the ship was first discovered. As the years passed, the story of the Mary Celeste transformed into a legend. The image of a perfectly intact ship drifting across the ocean without a crew captured the imagination of people around the world. It became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that even in a world governed by logic, there are events that defy explanation. The mystery was not just about what happened, but about what could not be proven. The absence of answers became the most powerful part of the story. At night, the ocean becomes a place of shadows and uncertainty. The idea of a ship drifting alone in such darkness is deeply unsettling. With no lights, no voices, and no signs of life, the Mary Celeste would have appeared as nothing more than a silent shape against a black horizon. For those who later heard the story, this image became one of the most haunting aspects of the mystery. It represented not just the disappearance of a crew, but the complete loss of human presence in a place where it should have remained. Today, the mystery of the Mary Celeste remains unsolved. Despite countless theories and investigations, no one has been able to explain what truly happened to the crew. The ocean has kept its secrets, leaving behind only questions and speculation. The ship itself has become a symbol of the unknown, reminding us that even in an age of exploration and understanding, there are still mysteries that remain beyond our reach. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: sometimes the answers are simply never found.